Welcome to the Parenting Coach Podcast with Crystal. Over 7 years ago, I felt like I was stuck in this cycle of yelling and reactivity in my parenting that I did not want to be in, but I didn't know how to get out of. I knew how I wanted to parent pretty much exactly, and I'd spent hours reading books, but not finding a way to show up how I wanted to. That's when I started to turn inwards. My own inward journey was what my family needed. As I changed, everything around me changed. My kids' meltdowns decreased by 90% or more with no medications or therapy. I stopped yelling, sibling fighting became almost entirely non-existent, and I found that this change flowed into other areas of my life too. My intuition increased. I started to run my life and business in a very different way. If this sounds like something you want to, I can help. Join me each week as I share my journey, including the laughter, fun, hard times, and tears. Tune in for support, guidance, and fun conversations with my favorite experts, and really anything else that interests me too. Welcome to today's podcast episode 13, The Whole Brain Child, Emotions and Parenting with Dr. Dan Siegel. Using research and knowledge about the brain, we can not only help parent our kids better, but help our kids develop their brains in ways that will benefit themselves, their future relationships, and the world. Today, you'll hear my conversation with Dr. Dan Siegel, who's the executive director of the Mindsight Institute and founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. He's an award-winning educator. He has written 15 books. 5 of them are New York Times bestsellers. They're available in over 40 languages. He was trained in attachment research and narrative analysis, focusing on how relationships shape our autobiographical ways of making sense of our lives and influence our development across the lifespan. And in today's episode, we talk a lot about the brain. We talk about his hand model of the brain and the left and the right brains and the downstairs and the upstairs brains and how this knowledge is actually going to help us parent even better. We're going to talk about how to help develop their upstairs brain and get them from downstairs back to upstairs again. We also talk about mirror neurons and body language and how to separate our own emotions in those times where we're feeling a lot of big feelings and how we can kind of separate us from them in order to parent them in better ways. We also, and near the end, talk about teens and tweens and why it's important for them to actually push back on the norm. Why it's important for them to be what we call rebellious. And we also talk about resources and books to help in parenting teens and tweens. Hello, and welcome to today's podcast episode. I am again excited for another cool interview. I know every week I'm like, oh, I'm really excited for this interview, but I'm just as equally or more excited for this interview today. I'm excited to bring you an author that I have been reading his books for years in the parenting sphere. He's world-renowned and has so many great insights for us. And I know this is going to be a great conversation. So welcome to the podcast, Dan Siegel.
Thanks, Crystal. Great to be here with you.
Thank you. So I was just telling Dan, years ago when my kids were little, I started reading little clips of his books and seeing little video clips and whatnot. So I feel like I've known you and your work for a long time because my youngest is now 18. So I've been in this world for a while. So the book that I've been kind of reviewing before we have gotten to this episode today is The Whole Brain Child. And I think it's awesome. It's by you and Dr. Tina Payne Bryson, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. And I would love to talk about the whole brain. How do we help our children use their whole brain? What happens in disintegration, which is what I think you call it, and how we can kind of help our children reintegrate when they're having tough moments, big emotions, things like that. So, so let us know, what does the whole brain mean?
Well, the whole brain means that, we as parents come as adults to raising kids. And often a lot of our own experiences may have us not access the whole of who we are. Mm-hmm. So I wrote a book called Parenting from the Inside Out with my daughter's preschool director, Mary Hartzell. And in that book, it's kind of like how the journey of inner discovery is actually the best gift you can give to your children, which kind of surprised people, but that's what the research shows. So Tina Payne Bryson was a student of mine who then had a little baby at home. Her youngest is now of 3, is now applying to college. But this was years ago. And so she started studying with me, and then we started working together. And we wanted to find a way to apply this field that I had been working in called interpersonal neurobiology, which looks at basically integration, how you have differentiated parts of a system like the brain and how they link together to form a really flexible, coherent, harmonious whole. So when we were choosing a name for the book to try to translate these ideas directly for parents, because Inside Out was already written. So now it was like, what could interpersonal neurobiology offer on what parents not just do inside themselves, but what they do with their kids? we decided to write a book called The Whole Brain Child, meaning how do you as a parent make sure you're cultivating the integrative process inside of your child. And, that's where that book comes from. So we have steps that look at different domains of integration that are really accessible for parents. And it's been incredibly exciting and rewarding to see how these science-based parenting approaches actually work and how parents can learn them relatively quickly and apply them immediately and see positive results.
Yeah. And I love you have lots of little like downloadable PDFs to kind of like almost like a little cheat sheet of things people can print off. So we'll make sure we link to those also. But let's talk about some of those spaces. So let's talk about, you talk about left brain, right brain, upstairs brain, downstairs brain. Let's get into that a little bit.
Yeah. So the overarching idea is different aspects of a system like your brain. You can have them uniquely developing. So the left is quite different from the right. The upper part is different from the lower part. And when you recognize that as a parent, then you can realize that you can tune into your child's experience by knowing which part of their brain is the most active. And the reason that's important, and not just an intellectually interesting thing, but actually a practically useful thing to know, is that once you see, oh, it's my child's right hemisphere that's active now, you want to tune into that right hemisphere and not use your left, which is full of logic and language and linear thinking, all those L's, that then bombard a child who's in the middle of our right hemisphere experience. You're not going to be able to really connect before you can redirect.
Yes.
So basically you want to tune in first before you try to transform how they are. And that's a step that many parents forget about or never learned about. And so they try to change their child without connecting to their child first.
Yes. Yeah. We see this so much. I mean, I see this, I still have parenting experiences every single day, luckily, that I can just use as these great examples. But lots of times where I'm either feeling overwhelmed or my daughter's feeling really overwhelmed. That's my 8-year-old right now. And I can tell myself, I can notice me get into that logical space where I'm trying to explain to her, why it's not that big of a deal or why we're doing what we're doing or whatever, when she's for sure not in her left brain space. So let's talk about that right brain space when someone's more in that, what we can do to kind of connect and then redirect with them.
Yeah. So the right hemisphere doesn't have language with words. It has communication for sure. And those are the nonverbal signals we send: eye contact, facial expression, the tone of your voice, your posture, the timing and intensity of what you respond with. And these nonverbal signals convey a huge amount of really important information. So if you as a parent are just going to use language to respond to all these nonverbal signals your kid is sending, whether they're calm signals or intense signals, you're not going to connect with them. They're not going to have this experience that a patient of mine once named. I can see her right now as she's saying it. The experience is feeling felt. So when you feel felt by your other person, in my case, I was a therapist with my patient, but when you have the experience in your life with a romantic partner, with a friend, with a family member, in the case of a child with a parent, with your parent, you have this amazing experience of joining. And that happens through the right hemisphere. But so much of school sort of teaches us that that's not important, that hemisphere. And, they may not name the hemisphere, but they emphasize language and learning and list making and all these L's, and those things are important too. So the idea is not to get rid of your left, but to add your right. So when a kid is in the right hemisphere, they don't have words to say how they're feeling, but the body, which is the origin of emotion, first sends its interior signals up only, for the most part, only to the right hemisphere. So the interior of the body is felt by the right. It's the origin of raw emotion. And so the child is now flooded. And in the first 18 months of life, they're a right hemisphere dominant being. So if you haven't gotten your right hemisphere back on board to connect to your toddler, or even, earlier, your infant, you are not going to be relating to them in a way where they feel felt. They're going to feel alone. And that isolation is going to make them have even more intense negative reactions to things that go on. So you can stop this cycle of all these tantrums and all these negative interactions by tuning in with your right hemisphere. So that's the story of the right and left. And when we begin the whole brain journey, we can start there, but it's just the beginning, because there's also the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain and all this stuff, that when you learn that, it's amazing how empowering it is for your parenting to become more effective, but also more fun. Mm-hmm. Because now you're saying, oh, my job is I'm an integrator. I need to honor these differences and promote their linkages in the course of our communication. And that's something, when you learn the skill, it becomes super fun and super effective then to be a parent.
Yeah. So let's take it through kind of a real life example. One that comes up, I think, for a lot of people is them trying to put their kids to bed, and they come out over and over and over again. And eventually their children kind of, freaks out or cries or whatever, is showing a lot of big emotions. So in that moment, connecting to the right brain and would be less words, less explaining things logically. And it would be more of looking at their body language, tuning into their body language, comforting, connecting, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so there's a couple of layers here. Number one, it's totally understandable when people take a behavioral approach for them to say, hey, I don't want to be affectionate with my child when they're getting up out of bed, because that's reinforcing their behavior. And I don't want to do that. So, that's totally understandable. On the other hand, if you just say, go back to bed, your child's not feeling felt, they're not feeling connected. So there's a real beautiful art form to connecting before you're redirecting. And that's the secret sauce right there. So that what you do then is you would say something like, assuming there's no specific, problem, like the window's open, needs to be closed, or, they're having some kind of medical problem, you say, oh, I know it's so hard to just say goodbye to such an exciting day. And, oh, it's going to be so amazing tomorrow morning when we get a good sleep in. And so now you're hugging your child and you're caressing them. You say, I know. So it's time to go to bed. This is not a time for playing. Let me walk you back to your room. And so you set limits. So you're creating structure, which is so vitally important. Your child learns how to hear no. And Tina and I wrote another book called No Drama Discipline, which walks you through step by step how to do that. So it kind of overlaps with that. But the issue there is that it's not that you become a laissez-faire parent, which means anything goes, I have no structure. No. We're not saying that whatsoever. Secure attachment depends on creating that structure. Those boundaries are really vital for your child to learn. But you learn to do it not by dismissing what they're going through, but attuning to it and then saying, yeah, I know you really want to be out here where the adults are talking, and I totally get that. And, at your age, you need a lot more sleep than we do. And so I understand you're frustrated. And now let's go back to bed. Rather than just go back to bed. We all know how well that works. And then they come out about it 10 times. Yeah, it's a whole different experience. It takes a different state of mind. You got to be clear about your boundaries, that you're going to say, no, you're not coming out to be with the adults who are, out there continuing the evening events. And your child needs to go to bed.
Yeah. And I think what you said was really important too, in that a lot of times when I talk to people about parenting through attachment, through secure attachment, that they say things like, that means you're with your kids all the time, or that means you let your kids do whatever they want all the time, that there's no boundaries. And like you said, it's that laissez-faire parenting. That's not secure attachment. Secure attachment needs structure and needs reliability and safety.
Absolutely. Yeah. And,
So
the research has some terms that are really confusing in just the way the words sound, but it's a difference then between passive parenting, that laissez-faire, do whatever parenting, and what's called at the other extreme is authoritarian, which is like being a dictator. But what you're aiming for and this is where it sounds so similar, is authoritative.
Authoritative. Yeah.
And
I
so
don't even
Terry
usually use that word
tative,
because it's so confusing.
I know. That's
Yeah.
why I pretty much never use those words, because
Mhm.
as an educator, it just confuses people more than clarifies it for them.
Yeah.
But the issue there is an authoritarian is just saying, go to bed. That's the end of it.
Mhm.
Authoritative says, I see your frustration because you had so
Mhm.
much fun tonight. And yes, it was so great to be together. And now you slow your words down a little bit and you say, and I know it's so hard to go to bed, but getting a good night's sleep is so important. You like that. And then your child goes, yeah. And then you walk them back to bed and they go to bed and then they go to sleep, because you've created this authoritative, this, you are a person of authority. You are not just their friend, you're their parent, and you can be friendly, but you are not their friend.
It's also the feeling felt. I think what you, in the example that you used, like you're coming alongside them. They're feeling seen, they're feeling heard, they're feeling known. And so it's helping them to feel that safety that they need in order to rest.
That's right. Because when they get yelled at, they just feel ashamed for wanting to be with the adults at the party, to use that example further. So, I mean, this is where, secure attachment and, parenting approaches that use the word attachment actually don't use attachment science. They just use the attachment word. So be very, very careful of that. Being an attachment researcher myself, I can tell you that knowing what the science says, which is that structure is really important, consistency is really important, and it's not about a child just being with you alone. And by the way, the research also shows we have something called alloparenting, ALLO, which means that human beings have this incredibly important capacity to have more than one attachment figure.
Yeah.
Because I know there's so much pressure placed on mothers under the name of attachment issues. And it's just wrong that, in fact, we humans evolved to have more than one attachment figure. Perhaps you have one primary attachment figure, but we are perfectly capable. In fact, it's good for us to have more than one attachment figure.
Yeah.
I've seen so many moms who are pressured beyond belief to think that, if I'm really mom enough, strong enough, bold enough, I can do it. It's nonsense. It's just so wrong. It's not consistent with the science of, healthy human development.
Yeah. Yeah. I would love for you to talk about the brain a little bit more in the downstairs and upstairs brain, because I think that one is so helpful.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about those differences and what we can do to parent when our kids are maybe in their downstairs brain.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the idea there is, again, differentiation. Differentiation means different, that there are different parts of our systems. And you can have a system that we're looking at as the brain. So we had left and right we began with. Now we're going to go to up and down. And for fun, we decided to draw a picture of a house and have parents have the image of an upstairs of the house, part of the brain, and a downstairs part of the house.
Yeah.
Now, originally, some neuroscientists would say, oh, that's too simplified, But in fact, if you get a little more detailed and talk about the specific areas, they say, those names don't apply anymore. So it actually was very useful to have broad categories of up and down. And that's actually held up as a vocabulary over all these years. So the bottom line is, when we grow in the womb, our downstairs brain, which for those who want to know, this would be the brain stem and areas just above it that used to be called the limbic area. Now people don't want to use that term anymore. So you can just say they're below the higher part of the brain. The higher part of the brain is called the cortex. So for those who want to know more scientific terms, these are the sub, meaning beneath, cortical meaning the outer part of the brain. So it's below the outer part of the brain. So that's what we mean by the downstairs brain. Now, the downstairs brain is formed pretty much in utero, in the womb. And then you come out, and then you're going to learn a lot through your upstairs brain. So that's cortical learning. And I just finished a book that'll come out next month for therapists, but it basically informs therapists about the science of temperament and how it relates to the subcortical that is downstairs brain. So that's a whole nother thing that we can get into at another time. But here, just let me say that these are your basic needs that are being met: breathing, digestion, controlling your heart's functioning, your temperature, all these like basic essential needs that include, your embodied empowerment that we call agency, your need for relational connections because you're a mammal. So this is for bonding, and your need for some kind of predictability, which we call certainty. So agency, bonding, and certainty, ABC, if you want to remember it that way. And these are your basic downstairs needs that create what are called motivations. They motivate you. So they create these goal-directed behaviors to try to get your brainstem and limbic areas, your downstairs brain needs met, right? So when this push for these needs being met is without a kind of cortical oversight, they can be very raw. And when they're raw, when they're coming out, like if my need for competency and agency, the sense of this embodied empowerment, if it's frustrated, I get angry, right? So you can see a kid pop out with all this downstairs originating anger. You can also see kids with a drive for connection when they feel that that's threatened or it's actually broken, they get what's called separation distress and sadness. Or if a kid needs certainty and it's not there, and without prediction, there's no protection. So they feel really unsafe. So then they feel fear. And if it's really bad, they're not only anxious and fearful, they can get terrified. And those are all downstairs brain, raw, core, primal is what one researcher calls them, emotions, when your basic motivational needs for agency, bonding, and certainty are not met. And there are other ones that come when those are kind of combined together that some people call esteem, a need for feeling worthy and have but seen well in other people's eyes. Trust and control. Those are kind of combined needs when you combine agency, bonding, and certainty. All that is to get a feeling of wholeness, you need all of these needs to be met. So any of them, when they're frustrated, can lead to these intense emotions of anger, sadness, and fear. And so what happens when those raw, downstairs brain emotional core experiences come out, in a kid, you as a parent may go, oh my God, what's wrong with my kid? They're like out of control. There's such intense anger. There's such intense separation distress. There's such intense, fear going on. What's going on? What's going on? So by understanding this is their downstairs brain communicating what it's experiencing. And when the cortex, the higher upstairs brain, is not trying to modulate that or, regulate it or, be aware of it and calm it down, when it's offline, which is often offline in young kids, then you're going to get this raw downstairs stuff popping out at you. And for you, an adult with a big upstairs brain, you go, oh my God, what's all this stuff happening? I don't know what's going on. Well, with the whole brain child approach, we want you to know what's going on and know how to deal with it. So there's a lot of overlapping principles, but the idea is to tune into what's going on before you ever try to redirect, and to realize that when your child starts to feel connected to you, their cortex, their upstairs brain comes back online. And you're going to lend them your more mature, hopefully older anyway, for sure, older cortex, so that you don't, I call it flipping your lid. You don't get your upstairs brain offline. And then it's this raw drive of agency, bonding, certainty, the big ones, that can be, combined into, esteem, trust, and control. And all that stuff then is what we call a raw downstairs emotional experience.
Mm-hmm. This is interesting too, because one of the things you talk about in your book is mirror neurons, right?
Yeah.
So we might go in there and be like, oh yeah, I'm going to be calm and I'll connect and I'll understand they're in their downstairs brain, but then we don't because we match that emotion with them too. So tell us a little bit about mirror neurons.
Yeah, well, mirror neurons are a term that in the 1990s, some colleagues of mine in Italy discovered them, and they're called mirror neurons, and they were named that because they have a single neuron mirrors both perception and action, right? So in other words, if you perceive someone eating a peanut, your same neuron will participate in you eating a peanut.
Mm.
It's that basic. And what we've learned over the years, and it's a big controversial area. Some people don't believe in mirror neurons, but a lot of people do. But what we believe they do is they basically do two things. It's a whole system of neurons that are actually quite common in the human brain. Another colleague of mine discovered them in humans. What they do is they allow you to, I think it's better to think about it as sponging. They're like sponge neurons. They soak in what they perceive. So they do two things, two fundamental things. One, they allow you to imitate other people's behaviors. So if I were to yawn right now for you, Crystal, I see you trying to not
I know,
yawn.
I can feel it. I can feel it in my jaw.
Yeah. So that would be behavioral imitation. But at the same time, there's the second thing is simulation. I can get you to start feeling tired. If I could, oh my God, start yawning a lot, you're going to probably not only want to yawn, you're going to start feeling tired.
Yes.
That's your mirror neuron system simulating what you're perceiving in my state by my nonverbal signals that obviously are right hemisphere dominant that I'm sending to you. So, we're incredibly relational creatures, right? And even if you think about how we're narrative creatures too, we like to watch all these movies and hear stories. Our mirror neuron systems get deeply involved and we're feeling the whole story, and we're living it, we're sponging it in. That's why for me, I call them sponge neurons, which I told this to the people who discovered them. They said, okay, whatever, they said in Italian, but so they're really sponging in what we see someone doing, that's the imitation, and what we get a sense that they're feeling, that's the simulation.
So when our kids are, when they're, showing some big emotion, they want something and we tell them no or whatever, and they have all their big feelings, then we sponge those thoughts, feelings, whatever we imagine, even through their nonverbal cues into us.
Especially through their nonverbal cues.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is where that point is really important, because someone can be saying something like, I'm not angry, and the words are like saying one thing and your sponge neurons go, oh yeah, I'm feeling really angry. And then inside of us, what happens is it shapes our own internal state. And we have this interesting part of the brain, which is basically doing two things just adjacent to each other. The first thing is it says, oh, what's my body feeling? And you might go, I think I'm feeling tightness in my muscles and my jaw's really clenched. And I don't know what that is. And then the second part right next to it goes, is this thing that I'm feeling in my body actually mine? Or am I sponging it in from somebody else? And that's where you get empathy instead of over-identification. Because with over-identification, you go, well, I'm angry. I'm really angry. Well, no, actually, you're not angry. You're just sponging in the anger of someone you care about who's right in front of you. So that ability to distinguish, to differentiate in a system of two people is really important, because otherwise you become the anger of the other person.
Yes. Oh,
and of course, this is
so
helpful
good
in romantic relationships too, to figure out.
Yes, absolutely.
You know what I mean? So anyway, so the mirror neuron story or sponge neuron story is so important. And however the media, this is what I say to the naysayers, say, there's no such thing as mirror neurons. I say, whatever. We are relational creatures and our nervous systems resonate with that of the other. And what you want to do in the resonating is not become the other, just like guitar strings, they resonate with each other, make this beautiful sound when they're in harmony, but they don't become those six strings. They don't become the other strings.
Yeah. So I think the goal you're saying in that moment is to be able to pause and notice, like, wait, what is mine? What is not mine? How can I differentiate here so that I can have empathy for, but I'm not completely taken over. I don't become this anger or frustration that my, 4-year-old is. And then we move into noticing they're in their downstairs brain. And how do we connect with their downstairs brain in order to help them move upstairs again?
I have a phrase, name it to frame it. I used to say name it to tame it, but some people felt offended by the word tame. So I changed it to frame. And name it to frame it means you say to your child, I can see you have such a longing, to make sure you get your dessert. And so before dinner, you're really wanting that dessert. So you're so angry that you're not getting the dessert. I can really see that. So you're naming it, right? And research at UCLA shows, and other places too, shows that when you name an emotional state, it helps regulate that state. So you are naming the subcortical, the downstairs state with your cortex. Naming is a cortical thing. And you're inviting then two things. You're inviting your child to feel felt by you, but also to see that they can have a little bit of distance in that naming from the feeling of that core emotion. I really need to have a popsicle before dinner. This is what my body wants. And because we can get addicted to sugar or fat, you want to eat a big donut or whatever. These are things we're compelled to do. You're teaching your child to sense that feeling and to modulate it. Yes. Oh, I know. Just think about how delicious that donut's going to be after we have our lunch. But we're going to eat lunch first.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, what you say, the first part about the differentiation is so crucial, because can you imagine still feeling that anger yourself, becoming that anger yourself, and then trying to do these steps? Your kids are for sure going to notice your anger, right? If you're just like, yes, I know, they're not going to feel felt at all because you're just bringing that in.
Right. So you need a space to do exactly what you're saying, Crystal, to be able to hold their anger, name it yourself, name it in yourself, distance yourself from it, use your left hemisphere. So now you're bringing that in, differentiate the upstairs from the downstairs brain. You're bringing that in, and then you're also doing another domain here, which is relational integration, meaning you are allowing two people to communicate their different states, where you, instead of saying, stop talking like that, or you don't get a popsicle before lunch, or whatever you're going to say, you're actually showing that you see their desire for the donut, for the popsicle. You see that. And it's not going to happen before lunch because you are a parent to whom they can be securely attached, because you are setting the rules. Their job is to try to push on those rules, sometimes even break the rules. That's what they're there to do. It's not a mistake when they push against you. It's what they're there to do,
Yeah, I think so many parents are like, but then how do I stop this from happening? How do I get my kids to not melt down, to not feel big feelings, to not break the rules?
So here's what you do. You name the internal state. You frame it in an understanding where you hold it, and you set a limit. No popsicles or donuts before lunch. But I really, really want it. And what kind of mom or dad are you? Blah, 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 blah. You go, yeah, I know it's so frustrating to want something now and have to wait. It's so frustrating. I get that too. I want one too now. And that's part of what life is. You have to wait.
Yeah. That's how our brains learn and grow, right? Like you said in your book, like it's through experience. It comes through experience. So
I don't want to compare a kid to a dog, but I train my dog's cortex to wait. I don't need to wait when I give her food, but every time she gets food, she knows to sit down. I put the food right in front of her. She's so hungry. And I wait 10, 15, 20 seconds. I'm looking at her. She's looking at me. And until I say, okay, she does not eat that food. She's an amazing dog now because her cortex has learned to control her downstairs brain impulses. So if she loves playing ball. If she's chasing a ball and it goes off the curb, she does not go in the street. She stops dead right before the curb. Stops because she's learned what it means. I've told her, I've yelled at her when she went in the street when she was a puppy, and then she knows, okay, you don't go in the street. There was some dog growling at her this morning, and she went up to the curb and growled back at him like she should. And she did not go in the street.
So how do we help kids practice this skill? Of downstairs to upstairs, so that over time they can develop those skills.
Yeah. So you want to help their cortex learn with your assistance to basically squirt inhibitory peptides down onto the downstairs brain, so it has the impulse to run in the street to get the ball, for example, and the cortex gets involved. loves the enthusiasm of the downstairs brain to go chase the ball or do whatever, want the popsicle, that's fine. But the upstairs brain says, no, I've learned no, and I squirt GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid, this inhibitory peptides. I'm gonna put the brakes on my impulses, and I can control my impulses. But I can also acknowledge I want to eat that donut before lunch. I want to chase after that ball. I want to go growl at that other dog. Whatever. The cortex basically is the brakes for the impulses of the downstairs brain. The cortex is the upstairs brain. And that's a matter of learning it. I mean, I work sadly with some young adults who, for various reasons, their parents never said no to them. There's all sorts of reasons. They had terrible illnesses when they were young or whatever. And their parents just felt so guilty creating limits for this miracle child that lived. And so they never could say no because, oh my God, the child almost died. And now, unfortunately, what they've done is they've made this young adult, never grow inhibitory fibers. So they're basically living an entitled life where they don't feel like they need to control their impulse. And they go, if I have an impulse, my impulse should be met fully. Yeah. Imagine what that's like in a relationship with that person.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I see them as a couple sometimes individually, though that's more rare. But the issue there is they haven't grown this grit to be able to say, I can deal with frustration. I can handle my delay of satisfaction of my impulses. All this stuff is cortical learning, upstairs learning. And it happens relationally. Yeah.
I would love for you to explain the hand model of the brain just so that we can kind of keep an idea in our mind about what's actually happening within our brain. And then I want to move on to talking about slightly older kids also, because I want to make sure we get to that. So tell us a little bit about the hand model of the brain that you use to kind of help teach this to.
Yeah. Well, this is something I was doing with my patients years ago, because I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I see families and stuff. And I'm also a brain nut. So, I mean, I was, I grew up as a therapist in an era when no one was talking about the brain. And I, was trained in the brain. My neuroscience teacher of the brain was David Hubel, who won the Nobel Prize when I was in medical school with him.
Wow.
For basically teaching the world how experience changes the structure of the brain. So that was in 1981. So it was natural for me when I became a pediatrician and then went into psychiatry to want to know about the brain, but nobody was talking about it, which was just strange. I mean, the most they would say is, let's give this pill so that it makes this neurotransmitter more or this neurotransmitter less, or that. I mean, that was the extent that they would talk about it. So I was particularly interested in that. So with my patients, I felt like part of my role as a therapist was, as a secure attachment figure for them for sure. And we do deep, deep work. But another thing I always felt is I was an educator, like I was learning stuff about the brain. This was a decade of the brain, in the 1990s. So I created this hand model of the brain because, well, it was handy. And it was also like a handout. And people would always have it available to them.
Yeah.
And I realized if you put the thumb in the middle and put the fingers over the top, you have a pretty accurate model where the fingers over the top are like the upstairs brain, the cortex. If you lift up your fingers and then you have your thumb inside your palm, those would be the subcortical areas, traditionally known as limbic area for your thumb. You'd have two of them left and right to be a perfect model. And then you lift up your thumb and then you have your palm, which would represent the brain stem. But let's just call that all thumb and palm the downstairs brain.
Okay.
Subcortical and downstairs would be synonyms, same thing. And then your wrist would be where your neck is, where your spinal cord is coming up. So the spinal cord and also something called the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, are how the information from the body comes up into the brain proper inside the skull. So we have basically pathways both going from the body up into the brain and from the brain down into the rest of the body. So, we are very relational creatures. So I was always not wanting to overdo the emphasis on the brain. And in therapy, of course, you're working with relationships all the time. So my work has always been to look at the mind as being both an embodied, so in the whole body as well as the brain, and a relational process. So we won't get into that here, but just to say that for parenting, you need to realize the mind is not just brain activity. So when I wrote Parenting from the Inside Out with Mary Hartzell, it was all about like, how did relationships shape what remains inside of you as an individual? Well, then we need to look inside your brain. So you learn about that. And after I wrote that book with Mary Hartzell, Tina and I wrote our 4 books. They were always building on that idea that the mind is both relational and fully embodied. So the hand model is just one component that I use with patients. And ultimately, in the textbook I wrote for graduate school called The Developing Mind, this is kind of a joke, but, at the last minute before I was turning that book in to go to the printer, I realized I was talking so much about the brain and the brain's parts and how they're differentiated, but I forgot to put a picture of the brain in. So I actually called up the publisher. I said, oops, can I grab a couple of, available pictures of the brain? They go, it's already set. It's typeset. We can't add, no pictures. I said, well, can I add text? They go, sure, you can add whatever text you want, but no pictures. So I said, okay, well, I've been using this hand model of the brain with my patients. I'll just describe it as a hand model. So you'll see in this graduate school textbook, I talk about the hand model of the brain, but it comes from my working with patients. And the idea there is that, you have a left and right side of the cortex, a left and right side of some of the subcortical areas, the limbic areas. But ultimately, it allows you to see that when you put your fingers up, and of course, the skull never changes. So some neuroscientists say to me, why would you say it's flipping your lid? The skull doesn't flip open. And I go, it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor. And I know that needs your right hemisphere to understand it, but it is a metaphor. And so that's a metaphor. Flipping your lid is when those fingers pop open like a jack in the box. And then your downstairs brain, right, your subcortical areas, the thumb and the palm area, are free to do whatever they're going to do. It's not always negative. No, it's not always negative, but it can be uninhibited. Let's just use that term. And so in the uninhibited state, you can have all sorts of incredible fun. So let's not, say, oh my God, a downstairs brain is bad.
Yeah.
And when a kid is just learning to control their impulses, it can be dangerous. Slugging someone, biting someone, all the things we see the kids in preschool do. So, so they need to have the cortex to regulate, right? To monitor it and modify it. So you don't go biting someone when you get mad because they took your blocks.
Yeah.
So when a preschool teacher says, use your words, use your language, not your fists, we want our politicians to learn that too. We need to all learn that. It's like this saying, everything I needed to know, I learned in kindergarten. Hold hands when you cross the street, share your toys, right? Take a nap, relax, And so basically, that's why the hand model is so helpful, is because you could show flipping your lid, you could show left and right side, you show upstairs, downstairs. And ultimately, it just gives people literally a handle.
Yeah.
Sorry. Another hand thing, on what we mean by the brain. And the thing that's really cool from David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel, these folks who show this to us, the brain basically learns by changing the connections inside of it. And the more we can create an integrated brain, the happier and healthier an individual will be. So what Whole Brain Child does, what No Drama Discipline does, all these things. We have a book called The Yes Brain and another book called The Power of Showing Up. All of those are about how to use your parenting relationship, how you communicate and how you connect, to help stimulate the growth of integration in your child's brain. So that as an attachment researcher, what I could bring to the table was a fascination and knowledge, a little bit of the brain, and say that secure attachment is when relational integration, that is honoring differences and promoting linkages in a relationship, stimulate the growth of integration in the brain of the child. And integration in the brain of the child allows them to regulate their emotions, to be aware of who they are, to have an internal compass that guides them in life. It's a source of resilience, to have mutually rewarding relationships. And even when you get even larger about it, to realize, you have a body, but who you are is much bigger than a body, which I like to say is you're not just a me, you're also a we, and you integrate those. Me plus we becomes we. And that's, I think, how we have to help children of the future grow into this incredibly challenging world we're in. When we see all these fires going on in Canada, the United States, and Europe, when we see all the wars going on this earth, all this human created suffering is because we've excessively differentiated ourselves and we're not linking with compassionate connection. So we is just a simple word that can help us see what's the pathway to actually getting out of this mess that we've created for ourselves on earth. And I wrote a whole book called Intraconnected, which is a plea for people. And Tina and I tried to put it in some of our books too. For parents, you have the opportunity to actually have your child realize they're not just a me and a body. This is a identity integration domain. They are also their relationships with nature. They're their relationships with human beings. Human beings don't even look like them. Today is actually Indigenous Culture Day, Indigenous Peoples Day in the United States. And Indigenous cultures have taught this for thousands of years. First Nations folks in Canada, and we in European descent, have forgotten or maybe never knew these important Indigenous lessons. And so, we're not trying to idealize the past, but we need to recognize the view that we are all interdependent and that we have a responsibility to future generations is something we can teach our children. So whole brain living is really what you can do as a parent. And you can feel empowered in the face of what some parents feel these days, a lot of despair and a lot of helplessness. But in fact, I think we can turn this around. And it comes beginning with a parent's teaching of a child that who that child is not just a differentiated, separate solo self on their own. No, we are in this together as a human family. We're in this together as a family of all of nature. And when we start teaching that relational side of identity, then you get the identity integration part of whole brain parenting.
Okay. We don't have time to get into older kids, but I would love for you to just briefly touch on how do we, if we're like, yes, I agree with all of this, but my kids aren't that age. Maybe I feel like I've already passed that, 0 to 12 phase. Can I still teach them this integration? Can I still teach them this interdependent way of living, this whole brain way of living? And how? What resources can you connect with them with? And maybe you want to say a few words about that also.
Sure. I think the two books, one is for tweens called Now Maps that I wrote with Dina Margolin, and another is a book I wrote by myself called Brainstorm for teenagers. Addresses this directly. Those are times when the brain, yes, is continuing to integrate, but it does it in different kinds of ways as it gets ready for adolescence and then adolescence itself. So I think there are absolutely ways where you as a parent can learn about the remodeling of the adolescent brain and understand that an adolescent is not just an older toddler, or an older, elementary school kid, primary school kid. They're really going through a different and important, unique phase of life. And when you learn that, it becomes a whole different way of parenting. So Brainstorm is actually written for adolescents to read themselves, but you can peek into as an adult. And there's a whole thing I call the essence of adolescence, which is, there's an ES, emotional spark, that adolescents have. That's a very special and important aspect of the fuel that drives them, this deep emotional experience that many adolescents have. The SE of essence, so it spells the word essence, is social engagement, that they are absolutely dependent and connected to their peers. And sometimes parents feel threatened by that. And I know some Canadian authors have written, oh my God, you should push against that. I don't agree with that at all. So I think there's a real importance for cultivating meaningful relationships during the adolescent period. And this is true across all species. ES, SE, the N is novelty seeking. So adolescents have a drive because of change in their dopamine reward system to seek more novelty, and they get bored with things being the same.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for that is, to try to make a new world. So there's an evolutionary benefit for it, and we have to support that rather than feel threatened by it. And then CE is creative exploration. Adolescents think outside of the box, not all of them, but many, and they're sort of built to push against the status quo. And that helps human society flourish. So the way we look at, whether it's science or the arts or technology or, all these ways that you see new approaches, it's often adolescent minds are doing that creative exploration. So that essence is something we as adults shouldn't give up. And unfortunately, some of us as adults have lost our essence, and trying to get it back is an important part of even maintaining our own well-being. And when adults do that, especially as parents, you can connect to your adolescent's essence even more when you get back in touch with your own.
This is beautiful. Thank you. I feel like you have a book for everything. So maybe we'll have a link to all of your books for parents on parenting, books for them understanding themselves, books for teens, tweens, 0 to 12, we'll link to all of them.
Great.
How else can people connect with you if they have
our website has got a bunch of stuff, drdansiegel.com. So DRDAN, Dr. Dan, and then Siegel, SIEGEL, drdansiegel.com. And there's a bunch of videos there for parents, and you can do the Wheel of Awareness, which is a cool thing that people do, sort of a reflective practice that integrates consciousness.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of PDF handouts too. If you're listening to this and you're interested in the book that we specifically talked about in the beginning of the episode called The Whole Brain Child, you can go and grab some PDF handouts there about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks so much
for coming Crystal.
on with us, Dr. Siegel. This has been really interesting and so much information. So thank you.
Great. You're welcome. Great to be with you, Crystal. Keep up the great work.
Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, I would love for you to help spread the word by getting this message of support and guidance out to as many people as possible. So text it to your best friend or tag me on Instagram and share it. Leave a review, rate it, subscribe it, or follow on your favorite platform. Send me a DM on IG letting me know which parts have impacted you or what you'd like to see on future episodes. We'll see you next week.